Trump is talking like the clock has run out. Iran is answering like it's ready to absorb the next blow. And while all of that is unfolding, Americans are already paying more at the pump, markets are getting jumpy, and the risk of a much bigger war is creeping higher by the hour. Today's headlines are less about one single strike and more about a dangerous chain reaction. Trump is threatening Iran again, Iran is warning it won't back down, and the fighting is spilling into shipping lanes, regional bases, and civilian infrastructure. There's also a lot of spin flying around from every direction, so the real story takes a little sorting out. If you're getting value from this rundown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is moving fast, and the consequences are not staying overseas. For weeks, Trump has been signaling that a deal with Iran might be close. Then that tone snapped. In the latest round, he said the US could keep striking, and at one point he flat out said, "We're going to be attacking them very hard." That's not careful diplomacy. That's escalation language, plain and simple. According to the reporting, Washington's latest attacks were triggered by the downing of a US military helicopter near the Strait of Hormuz. The US framed its response as self-defense and hit Iranian targets including air defense and radar sites. Iran in turn fired back at bases hosting US forces in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. So instead of cooling off, the whole thing is turning into a back and forth that could still spiral. Trump also went further than just vague threats. He talked about possibly hitting power plants and bridges, and earlier comments had included water systems and desalination plants. That matters, because once you start talking about civilian infrastructure, you're no longer in the realm of a limited military message. You're in territory where the line between pressure and punishment gets very thin. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said the country will stand firm and will not yield if its dignity or territory is threatened. Iranian officials are also saying they won't sign an agreement unless their rights are recognized, so both sides are talking in absolutes, which is usually a bad sign. What's striking is how quickly the mood changed. One day you get talk of a near deal, the next day you get a message that Iran has taken too long and will now pay the price. That kind of whiplash is exactly how crises become mismanaged, and when officials act like pressure alone is a strategy, ordinary people are the ones who end up carrying the costs. The most worrying part of this latest episode is that it isn't staying confined to military targets. Iranian media says US strikes damaged 2 water reservoirs in Siri County, cutting off drinking water for around 20,000 people during brutal heat. If that report is accurate, this is not some abstract battlefield issue. This is families losing clean water in temperatures that hit 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. That is the kind of story that often gets buried under clean language from official briefings. One side says precision strikes, the other side says flagrant terrorism. The truth may be less dramatic than both extremes in some cases, but civilian harm is very clearly part of the picture. And when water infrastructure gets hit, the moral and legal questions get a lot harder to dodge. Meanwhile, US Central Command said it also struck a tanker in the Gulf of Oman after the crew allegedly failed to obey directions. 3 Indian crew members are missing, and India has already protested the attack and summoned a US diplomat. The International Maritime Organization condemned it too, warning that the safety of seafarers and commercial shipping can't be treated casually. That shipping piece matters more than a lot of commentators admit. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. When that area gets militarized, the whole world feels it. Not just Tehran, not just Washington. Everyone who buys fuel, ships goods, or depends on stable trade gets dragged into the fallout. Trump even said he had ordered a secret military mission to help commercial vessels move through the strait, though Central Command wouldn't give many details. That's the kind of thing that sounds reassuring until you remember how often temporary security measures become permanent entanglements. Here's where this stops being an overseas headline and starts hitting the average American wallet. US inflation has climbed to a 3-year high, and a big reason is energy. Gas prices are up sharply, oil has surged, and the cost of moving everything from food to freight is rising with it. The latest consumer price data showed inflation up 4.2% from a year earlier, with gas jumping 7% in just 1 month, and more than 40% compared with a year ago. That is brutal for working families. It's one thing to hear officials say the economy is strong, it's another to stand at the pump and watch the total climb while wages are barely keeping up. Real wages actually fell again, which means the average worker is losing ground. And if oil keeps climbing because the Strait of Hormuz is unstable, that pressure doesn't stay in the energy sector. It bleeds into groceries, shipping, airline costs, and eventually mortgage and credit conditions if the Fed decides inflation is getting sticky again. Markets are already reacting. Gold is under pressure because traders expect tighter policy if energy prices keep rising. Stocks are wobbling too. That's a reminder that war talk is never just war talk. It becomes a tax, just not one that gets voted on. Trump, for his part, called the inflation numbers great, which is a hard sell when families are looking at utility bills and gas receipts. He's also claiming prices will fall once the war ends. Maybe, but that's a huge maybe to hang the economy on. The simpler truth is that every new flare-up in the Middle East makes life more expensive at home. And if you take a more limited government view of this, the problem gets even clearer. Americans should not be paying endless premiums for foreign policy decisions that seem to change by the hour. While the Iran story is getting the most attention, the broader regional war is still very much alive. Lebanon is taking a pounding. The Lebanese health ministry says at least 30 people were killed in one day of Israeli strikes, and more than 3,600 have been killed since March. The strikes hit Tyre, Sidon, and other southern areas, even as the so-called ceasefire remains on paper. That gap between what's written and what's happening on the ground is getting harder to ignore. People in Tyre are being ordered out of neighborhoods. Families are fleeing. Local officials are warning that the occupation is deepening rather than winding down. Whatever language governments use, civilians are still the ones running for cover. Gaza is no different. Even with the world's attention swinging toward Iran and Lebanon, the violence there never stopped. Reports say nearly 1,000 Palestinians have been killed since the latest ceasefire agreement took effect, with aid still badly constrained. Children are still being killed, crossings are still being throttled, and humanitarian access remains far from normal. This is where the larger pattern becomes impossible to miss. Each front is feeding the next. Israel strikes, Iran responds, Lebanon burns, Gaza stays trapped. Shipping gets hit, oil rises, then Washington gets pulled deeper in. That's how regional wars stop looking regional. There's also a hard question here that a lot of coverage skips over. If the goal is to stabilize the area, why does the result keep being more instability? Some reports treat every escalation as if it were a neat tactical exchange. Real life doesn't work that way. The families displaced from Tyre, the children in Gaza, and the sailors missing in the Gulf of Oman aren't living inside a strategy memo. Back in Washington, there's a lot going on besides Iran, and not all of it inspires confidence. Bill Gates testified behind closed doors to the House about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, denying knowledge of Epstein's criminal conduct and saying meeting him was a grave mistake. The committee says it still wants more answers, especially about who knew what and who was protected. That story matters less as celebrity theater and more as a reminder that transparency in Washington is often selective. The public gets partial files, redactions, and carefully managed statements, while the full truth takes years to emerge, if it ever does. At the same time, Trump is facing criticism for how he's handling the Iran crisis, with some opponents arguing he's lost control of it. Even some of his critics, though, miss the wider point. The issue isn't just one man's messaging. It's the bipartisan habit of sliding into foreign conflicts without a clear end state, then acting surprised when the costs come home. There's a bigger pattern here, too. U.S. forces are also operating in other hotspots, including Nigeria, where airstrikes reportedly killed civilians along with militants, according to local accounts. That story hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves, which says something about how quickly counterterrorism becomes background noise when it's not politically convenient. The common thread is simple: more intervention, more secrecy, more blowback. And the bill usually lands on taxpayers, service members, and civilians far from the decision makers. Trump has moved from talking about a deal with Iran to threatening more attacks, including possible strikes on civilian infrastructure. Iran is responding with its own military action, and the risk of a wider conflict is growing. The immediate fallout is already visible in shipping, water access, and energy prices. If the Strait of Hormuz keeps destabilizing, American consumers will feel it fast. And beyond Iran, the region is still on fire. Lebanon and Gaza remain trapped in ongoing violence, while Washington's own transparency problems and foreign policy habits keep raising the same old question: who exactly is paying for all this, and for how long? That's the story for now, but it's moving quickly, and the next headline could change the picture again by tomorrow. If you want more straight updates without the fluff, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Do you think this is headed toward a deal, or are we looking at a much bigger war?